Hello, everyone. Welcome. Today's blooper is a sign in a Copenhagen airline ticket office, which very simply said in English, the reassuring message that we take your bags and send them in all directions. So just what a traveler wants to hear, right? Today's guest is Doug Bruhnke, the founder and CEO of the Global Chamber. Doug is an entrepreneur dedicated to helping members of the Global Chamber successfully reach new markets across 525 metropolitan regions, which basically means the whole world. He is a two-time expat with Dupont in Tokyo and in Singapore, and with over 35 years of global experience in nearly all countries and segments. Doug is also a regional advisor to the US Global Leadership Coalition and a member of the Arizona District Export Council, as well as the British American Business Council of Northern California and others. He has a BS in chemical engineering from the University of Utah and an EMBA from Michigan State University, and is a co-inventor on 5 patents. Doug was born in Mount Kisco, New York, and is now based in both Scottsdale, Arizona, and Palo Alto, California, here in the United States. So welcome, Doug. Delighted that you're with us.
Very happy to be here. Thank you, Philip, for the invitation. Looking forward to a conversation today.
Okay. So perhaps we could start by your telling us a bit about your background and how a nice boy from Mount Kisco got to be so globally minded and globally oriented.
Yeah, in retrospect, I think part of what got me there was the trips to JFK Airport as a young child, picking my grandparents up on their visits to Germany. I thought I was all German, but it turns out the Bruhnke side is Polish, but my maternal side would visit Germany while I was a child. And I really didn't feel any strong connection to the world, or like that might lead to something. But I do remember fairly vividly JFK Airport. My grandfather was an entrepreneur, and he had this 1964 black Lincoln Continental with white leather interior, kind of a magical design and car in and of itself. And then that terminal at JFK, I guess it's the TWA terminal, in its heyday, was pretty futuristic and pretty amazing, kind of combined with the 1964 World's Fair, which I also was probably my first memory as a child. So the World's Fair in 64, picking my grandparents up at JFK Airport, that something about that Lincoln and the design and all of that combined somehow led eventually to me getting interested in the world. It took me a long time, but it finally clicked years later.
That's wonderful. I've got a connection to the 1964 World's Fair also. I remember visiting it with my father. I guess it was probably the same time, but we kept visiting the same pavilion, the NCR pavilion, for like 3 or 4 days in a row, or at least 3 or 4 presentations in a row. And the woman who was presenting, turned out, he told me later, a week later, that he was going to marry this woman, and she became my beloved stepmother. So that's my connection to the World's Fair.
That's amazing. So and you remember it. That's awesome. I was in kindergarten, so it was one of my first memories. The JFK assassination actually was one of them, and then the year later was the World's Fair, and I can barely remember anything else. So I think that was the seed that was planted. It didn't get really grown until later. Through most of my childhood, I was very interested in sustainability and environmental, and I became a chemical engineer to clean up the world, to understand it scientifically. And still, I was thinking about the world, if you will, like how do we clean it up collectively, but I wasn't thinking about the business side until I worked for Dupont. And then even eventually, I wasn't there until the guy for Teflon, who was doing business development in Asia, was retiring, and they needed a replacement. And then finally the opportunity kind of seeded in my head, maybe this is something for me. But it took that long. I was 27 years old, so it took that long for me to finally realize the opportunity, take advantage of the opportunity, and then in January of 1987 take my first trip to South Korea one day early. And it was life-changing. It changed my life.
And I know you speak Japanese, but had you known anything about Asia before that time?
Almost nothing. I spoke a little French and a little German. I took French in junior high and high school, and German, and I grew up with German. And then I really wasn't connected at all to Asia until that opportunity came up, which, by the way, nobody wanted. Everybody said, it involved travel, so, they didn't want to do it. And I was the youngest person by far in the technical support group, and to me it was like, well, travel sounds pretty good, and especially to Asia. I've never been there, and I'd love to go. I've always been an adventurous eater. And then it really took off when I went there. But yeah, I did not have a connection until that morning. That evening on a Saturday, I arrived in Seoul, and it was just starting to brew. And then the next day, it had snowed the night before. It was January of '87, and I walked around the Namdaemun market in downtown Seoul, and it just totally blew my mind. All of the sights and the smells and the sounds, and I literally spent the entire day from about 8 or 9 in the morning all the way through 6, 7 o'clock at night, walking around with my winter coat all over Seoul. And I got back to my hotel very excited, like, wow, this is life changing.
That's great. And you went from Seoul to Tokyo? Is that right?
On that trip, let's see.
Well, this was an exploratory trip, or
that was a business trip. So I needed to be there on a Monday. So and this was one of the things, I guess, that's kind of led me through my entire career is I didn't realize until then, and I probably didn't even realize till later, that what I thrive in is different environments and just being thrown into certain circumstances. And so it wasn't that trip, but a couple trips later to Korea. I've been there about 40 times. And then I lived in Japan and lived in Singapore and traveled to all the different countries there. But there was one time when they brought me to Hyundai Motor sometime probably '88 or so, it was the Seoul Olympics time.
Mm.
And they had all sorts of quality problems, so they wanted me to solve them. It's like, I'm 28-year-old engineer, yeah, but I mean, I don't know how to design a car or make fuel hose or gaskets and stuff like that. But they wanted to kind of pick my brain, and so I went to the floor of Hyundai Motor. I ended up doing a lot of work in the automotive industry and saw a lot of car plants over time. That was my first one. And they were asking me, to do stuff, and which was not unusual through all of my time. Here's the American, he knows, let's let him solve the problem, so that I would be thrown into circumstances that I had no idea what I was really entering. And ultimately, that has been, I think, the core connection for me to international, is the ability and the joy and, fortunately, some skill set around being able to ask questions, listen, and be able to ultimately solve problems at clients, in all sorts of countries. And so the intercultural thing, a lot of that to me is just kind of the engineering thing to some extent, just asking questions and solving problems. And you can go a long way in life by solving problems.
Absolutely. And you were able to do so with your chemical engineering background?
I think it's the kind of the question answer type that most engineers have, right? You're taught to ask a lot of questions and solve problems, no matter what kind of engineer you are. And the other thing for me, for being a chemical engineer is that I'm very process oriented. So whether it's the process of business and what it takes, meaning like what should the process be when we enter the room and how should we sit, like in Japan, right? The visitors are facing the door, so that you can, so you've got kind of all of that game going on within the meeting, or the post event where you've got to go to a dinner and then you go to another place and then you go to a third place, and the third place you don't talk about the next day, or really you don't talk about that ever the whole evening. So those process points about business, I think, are things I thrive in, not because I'm a chemical engineer. It's that I think I'm wired that way. And so chemical engineering fits with my own individual profile of things that I'm pretty good at and certainly enjoy very much.
That's fantastic. I think for the benefit of our listeners, it would be beneficial advantageous to elaborate on what you just said about the first post-dinner party, the second and the third. And as far as I understand it, it's sort of like the expression, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. So what happens in these parties stays in the room, and one doesn't talk about them outside, because people can get drunk and say all sorts of intimate details or thoughts that they would never want to share with certain other people or publicly. Is that right?
I think that's fair. You remind me too of just the basic idea when you're in another country. And let's use Japan, because I worked there for 5 years, and I've traveled there for decades, and I love Japan. I love the way they do things. And so for me, being part of a Japanese company was frustrating. And it was something that I recognized that I was comfortable tailoring myself to their style. So things like the way the bucho, the head guy for a division desk was at the end, and everybody's desk was lined up with the least senior person furthest away, and you're in one big room and you're all talking. So that takes some getting used to, because most folks are not used to working in a big room with a lot of conversations going on at the same time, but you begin to tune things in and out depending on what it is. So the basic idea of tailoring yourself to the local community, I think, makes a lot of sense. That's one example. The other is the one you point out, that at work, you're not going to necessarily be direct on everything like Americans tend to be, or Germans or Dutch. There's a spectrum, right, of cultures and how direct they are. Dutch for me is almost offensive, in depending on who it is. If it's somebody who does it deftly, being direct is fine, but it can feel like a sledgehammer, and too often for me it feels like a sledgehammer, because I'm used to the circular conversations that Japanese tend to have. I thrive in that, and in fact, when I go back to the U.S., they would say that they couldn't understand me because I was talking, I thought, very directly, but I had adapted the circular kind of conversation that occurs. So that's kind of what happens at work. And then you are free, certainly in the third place, to be quite direct, so that you don't have to worry about, you pretty much don't have to worry about what happens the next day. Many cases, I've got hundreds of stories of people being direct, and sometimes being too direct in that. But I did learn that's kind of the flow and the normal process for them, and I like that order. We in the U.S. don't have like any regular pattern around that. They at least have a pattern which is another reason why I think doing business in Japan is probably the easiest country that I've ever seen, because the patterns are very clear. You just have to be observant, and suddenly you find out what those patterns are. It really helps you do business.
Yes. Could you give an example? I know it's harder in English to do it, but can you give an example of the circular conversations that you were referring to? Japanese, the Japanese language, by the way, is vague for our listeners.
Yeah.
In that the you don't have to have a pronoun. You can imply something like uh, want wine, want beer, um, which basically means do you want wine or beer? But you can also have a verb and it can just be implying something, and it's not necessarily clear who you're referring to. And that vagueness, in a way, makes it more interesting because you're intuiting a lot, but also it helps create this circularness, which in a way is sort of non-committal. The commitment is in the consensus from the group. Is that
Yeah, no question. I find the Japanese language to be very poetic, a very lyrical, very so subtle, and just it's an art form of just the higher order. It's sort of like, the US steak and potato versus a kaiseki dinner of all sorts of different sizes and flavors, and
mm,
it's that kind of a difference between the languages. I think there's the language part of it, which is clearly different, where there's so much subtlety in the language itself. Then there's how you use the language and what you're actually saying. One of the more famous examples that I typically use is something that had frustrated me in our joint venture, where um, in the Osaka office for us, I was headquartered in Tokyo in a place called Gotanda, kind of a little bit of a dirty little area in Tokyo, not a premier area, but still quite a nice area. And we had offices in Nagoya and Osaka. And in the Osaka office, the smartest person in the office, I had ascertained, was this lady who was an OL, an office lady, OL. And so it's basically a secretary that does all of the activities, really does most of the work in this particular case, but they wouldn't let her sell. And I thought that it would make a lot of sense if we had the first woman salesperson within the company, and she was a clear example of someone who would be successful. So I did try at work to be direct enough to articulate and be very logical that this was something that needed to be done. And I tried doing it indirectly by talking about, it kind of generically. Then I started to get specifically about her and the sales role, and starting to connect that together. So it was like over weeks building it up, to first trying to get them to see the opportunity, then recognizing that they were not seeing the opportunity, being more and more direct, that let's get Fukumachi-san to be a salesperson in Osaka. That's the direct, right? So, but it took weeks to get there. So that was uncomfortable. Once we finally got there, it's like, first of all, it felt like a discovery for them. Like, so everybody kind of flutters around, and like, it's like, this is not comfortable, because now they don't know what to do, right? So what we ended up doing was then spending months, where I traveled 3 times to Osaka and did that 3 dinner thing each night. I had the conversation so that I got more and more direct toward the end. And finally, the third trip, the third place, they agreed to try it as a test. And as you might imagine, the end result was she was the best salesperson they ever had. But they were quite convinced that Toyota would never buy from a woman, and they were wrong. And it took a lot of pain and anguish to finally get there, but we got there.
that's amazing. Good for you. Um, I presume it's a position that she wanted.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I had talked to her about it, and she, definitely was capable enough. She didn't recognize that it could be possible necessarily,
Mm,
given the culture. I would say I do remember in my own experiences, Korea and Japan being a little tough in this area,
right.
particularly Korea being worse, in the sense of women not being given an opportunity. The first experience I had with that was during my early years, and a Korean American asking if she'd like to work for Dupont Korea. And I went there just kind of openly, not thinking it would be in any issue, but they said that it just wasn't going to work. Women could not work in business. This was 1988, so it's been a long time. It's changed quite a bit, but in those days, it just wasn't doable for multiple reasons. Just recognizing women in business, but then the evening work, the after five stuff with all of these places. Korea is very similar to Japan, where some of the after hours activity was male oriented. And so women could not really be part of the conversation. So those days are not gone. They're still around. We've had that in the U.S. as well. We know that has existed. I was in Detroit in the automotive industry when the Windsor Ballet was pretty much removed. So that was in the 90s. The Windsor Ballet was the strip clubs in Windsor, Ontario, across
Oh,
the river from Detroit. And all of the automotive people, not all of many of the automotive people would take the purchasing managers to the strip clubs in Windsor. And then at some point in the 90s, and certainly by early 2000, that was verboten. It was sudden, completely off the table. It was not allowed, and it was totally inappropriate. But it took that long. That was only 20 years ago when
right.
it was reasonably acceptable to do that. Culture is changing. that's the good news. And I think part of it is, for all of us, there's the respect for culture, and then there's recognition that there's behaviors that aren't necessarily really good, and some of these cultures, have been protecting bad behavior, and it doesn't make it right. That it's not part of the culture to abuse women or to not allow women to be advanced. Or at least I don't think so. I don't, and
Mhm.
I think there's certainly some people that might disagree with me. I think those of us that are hopefully a little bit more enlightened can both respect culture and the cultures that are presented to us, and also recognize that there needs to be progress within every culture to be able to give people these certain rights and abilities and fundamental human elements. Again,
Opportunities,
could be subject to debate.
of course, and to give them opportunities as well. That's what the United States is supposed to be about.
I think there's, and I wrestle with this a little bit, because you wonder, are there fundamental human elements that are things that we should defend? And I happen to believe that. So I think that we should give everybody the ability to do whatever. What you bring to the table is not your hair color or your skin color or your religion or your gender,
Right.
or who you love or anything like that. It's, hey, what can you do to contribute? And my own experience with that is, especially in Japan, as an example, where I was the only foreigner, uh, I recognized that we made bad decisions when there were not enough mix of people, too many men or all Japanese. Not that Japanese can't make good decisions, they make great decisions, but I find that teams that are more diverse are better. That's been my own observation, and that's actually been proven by research over time. Somebody was telling me that the other day, that they had proved in another way that diverse teams are more innovative and have the ability to do more. And so that's certainly something that you want to respect culture, but you also want to be able to bring diversity to the table.
Yes, very much so. Um, can you give some examples from your experience in Japan and Singapore and elsewhere, or what you've heard, perhaps of how businesses have changed their, basically adapted their products or their services for the local market. And it could be, management, packaging, pricing, color, size, very, whatever the cases may be.
Sure. Yeah. Most of my career has been in Asia. So, and I'm a German Polish American. And so my mentality, was kind of born in Europe and the US. And then to go to Asia was really mind opening because of the way the markets there are and the way products are perceived. And let's just take Japan, as an example. Japan is very hyper focused in on the appearance of product and the way it looks, the packaging, and all of that. You can't, like we Americans, we'll go to Costco or whatever, and the product is, maybe damaged goods, and we're willing to buy it. They're not interested in that. Typically, certainly not in like the big department stores or anything. They want everything perfect, and so the way that translated for me was, I worked for Dupont, and we had materials like Teflon and others. And so we would have situations where if our product did not look as expected, we would have problems. And one of the more famous ones for us was a product called Vamac, an ethylene rubber that we made in Texas and then processed somewhere in South Carolina. And it got shipped to Japan. And so it showed up in Japan, and there was dirt in it. It was like a clear plasticky rubber, and there was dirt. And Meiji Rubber was the company making oil hose, and it was going into Mitsubishi cars. And so we got a call on a Thursday night that this was unacceptable. They had to shut the line down, and so everybody scattered, and the whole day Friday we all worked at the plant, because the product had been shipped over, they shipped the product back to us from this place in northern Japan, and our team was pulling the dirt out of the product until we could ship new product from the US, right? And so some of it was airshipped, and then some of it. So we had to recognize that their perception was that this was a bad product. The way, of course, the Americans thought about it was, well, just put it through a screener. That's not, once it's dirty and once it's soiled, it's a bad product and it's not going to be acceptable. So long story short, we did survive it there. We found a way to get more product. I ended up, sadly, believing that the Americans knew what we were going to do, and I thought I had explained what needed to be done. So I ended up bringing the Mitsubishi Motor Company quality head to this place in Kingstree, South Carolina. We flew into Charleston. We go to this plant. It was like an hour or two away. And so we go to the plant, and even after all of this, like months of explaining, there they were processing the rubber. There was like dirt on the rubber, and some guy at the end was brushing it off with a brush. It was like, oh my God, seriously. And they thought that was okay, even after so much explanation. So there are cultural differences relative to perception of the quality of product that fortunately the US has gotten a lot better over the last 20 or 30 years, but it's been a journey. And, I used to have dark hair. And there have been a lot of cases like that, especially around product quality, that have just been near disastrous for us.
Fascinating. What about in terms of management style? Have you observed anything, or how have you observed the differences there?
By the way, on that particular case on management style, that there was that Friday when that all happened. Yeah. The big boss who ran Teflon and everything, he was in town. Dave Sanders, I'm sure he's retired a long time ago. So he shows up and everybody's gone. Basically it was, I stayed in the office to greet him, and there were a few other people. There was like 100 people in the office. So we probably had maybe 50 people in the office left. So he was deeply insulted that we were not greeting him like a head of state. He didn't understand how a quality complaint could interfere with his, treatment. at the office. So I mean, that's probably beyond culture. That's just being a jerk,
Or
and
whose
just not
ego.
have. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Just lack of fundamental business sense is what that was. So I think certainly part of management differences occur there, where certainly in Japan there's very much of a product focus. I think certainly there's a different people focus as well. There's a lot of after work activity that does happen in many of these countries, where there's a connectivity between the boss and the people after work. And that allows them at the third place typically to be able to articulate maybe some of their frustrations or find out more about how they're perceived at the company. So using those opportunities to have a dialogue rather than just walking into the office and saying, hey, I'm unhappy, or hey, how am I doing, am I going to be promoted? That's a very uncomfortable kind of a conversation in a lot of Asia, whereas a lot of that can be done much more softly and indirectly outside the office.
Right. You see, you had mentioned about the bucho, the division leader, basically.
Yep.
Is that the best translation, division leader or group leader, I guess?
Yeah, I think that either one should be fine. Yeah.
So the bucho's desk is sort of toward the front, and then people are arranged in a row in seniority toward the least senior person, or the most junior person is at the back of the room. When they have group conversations, is everyone's opinion respected, or is it very much again by hierarchy, that the junior person doesn't, his opinion doesn't count even if he's qualified to say something?
Yeah, certainly then everything was very hierarchical, and in my own experience was compounded by a fairly old Japanese company, Showa, that I really kind of saw like the last 100 years evolving right in front of me. Also, the automotive industry is in some ways progressive. Certainly the Toyota, Honda, Nissan, but when you talk about the supply chain, they historically have been fairly behind in terms of their progress in open management skills, especially like when you've got the Toyotas of the world, and Nippon Denso might be a supplier, and then somebody who supplies Nippon Denso, and certainly anybody supplying that company, they're probably pretty far behind. They're decades behind. And so a lot of my own experience was at the lower levels. I certainly was able to go to Toyota, and that was amazing. I thought it was fantastic, but it was a very different feeling to be at a Toyota versus several tiers down in terms of how management handled things, and the way just what people talked about, and how innovative they seemed to be.
At the lower levels, would companies sort of welcome and accept the opinions of sort of the junior staff, or again, was it that the junior staff was expected to be quiet and the upper people made the decisions?
Yeah. Generally, yes. Generally, that's the case. However, just like everywhere, there's personalities, and so some younger people are more brazen, if you will, or rude. Probably they would consider them to be rude, and they would eventually be beaten down. Right, the Japanese saying of "the nail sticks up, gets beaten down." And so, if some younger person, would interject their own opinion, prior to a more senior person speaking, they'd be beaten down, and they'd be probably told, during the evening hours about their, rudeness, and they would consider that to be rude. Again, I think in technology it's quite a bit different, and it's evolving for the better. However, in general, that is still the case, that
Mm.
even when I deal with fairly advanced Japanese companies relative to what Americans are used to, there's much more of a hierarchical depending on where you are. The
Right.
Bucho down all the way down to the OL, and then from the Bucho up to the Kakaricho and the Shacho, which is the president of the company.
Right. Um, in all your global experience, especially with running the global chamber, what have you found to be I want to say the most difficult country or the most difficult culture to work in? And difficult, of course, is a relative word, because it's coming from our perspective. But in terms of whether it's business barriers or just business culture or business procedures, or that you can't make changes that easily, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, I over the years have had periods of time when different countries were more challenging to me. I would say there's not really one that stands out, but there are elements of almost every country
Mm.
that are either disappointing, might not be the right word, but uncomfortable. I remember in early in my career, both Malaysia and Indonesia was uncomfortable for me because it was so not Christian. In the sense of, not that I'm necessarily a very good Christian, not at all. I was very not very religious as a child, and I'm a Greek Orthodox because of my wife. It kind of doesn't really matter, but because of a country that has a different religion that is more visible, it felt more uncomfortable to me. Contrast with now, like my last trip to Indonesia, I thought it was amazing. It was like, wow, I love the fact that they're doing the prayer call like at 2 a.m. There was something magical about that for me. I just thought it was fantastic. So I think it depends on how you embrace
Right.
some of this thing. I would say the countries that are less, I was going to say the word evolved, but there are countries that are rougher to
Mm.
deal with. And for me, China, quite honestly, has always been rougher. The people have been less kind, at work. And I think that's one of the things I really love about Japan is, despite all of kind of the stuff that happens, there's a fundamental kindness around the process that feels really comfortable for me.
Right.
Korea, I would say, is not quite the same, but there's many of similarities. It's a little bit rougher, especially 30 years ago. It's much more refined and cultured, and I think beautiful now,
Right.
because of the way it's evolved. China still, for me, has always been a little bit rough. And it was more of a street fight. When I do business, I don't want to be in a street fight. I just want to have, a good conversation and move things forward. And if there's a dance that goes on, I'm willing to do the dance. I find it entertaining almost to do that.
Right.
When it's like a hammer over your head, it can feel a little uncomfortable. Where it did play out in China for me in a positive way was, as an example, a price negotiation I had to do in Taichung, Taiwan, where I was raising the price about $1 million a year to this client, and right before I arrived, I got an email to say that they had a quality complaint, and it turned out it was about $1 million worth of quality complaint. So I was like, uh-oh, okay. So I think I see what's going on here. So I did a plant tour and I had a conversation, and then we had lunch in a fish market, and we had a table with about 12 people, and he was on one side and I was on the other, and then there were all the intermediaries around the table. So we had a lunch, and we started with one bottle of whiskey, and it was largely him and I drinking that bottle of whiskey. And then they took a second bottle out. And so basically, I felt like I drank probably three-quarters of a bottle of whiskey. It couldn't have been that much, I don't think, but it was clearly not comfortable. And what was normally I'm a 6'4", fairly big boned fellow. Normally I can drink Asians under the table very easily. This was a guy that was about 6'3", softball player, very muscular. He could drink. And so he and I were going toe to toe. And finally, at the end of it, we did come up with a conclusion that we would delay the price increase by 6 months, and he would drop the quality complaint. So we did come out with a good conclusion. However, the drive back to Taipei that day from Taichung was very painful for me, although it was mostly sleep. And the bad part of all of that was at 4 a.m. the next morning, we needed to meet in the lobby of the hotel to go golfing the next day with an important client. So that's part of the fun of international, right? Of you've got this thing that's kind of unexpected, you find a way to survive it, and then you start again the next day.
Right. That's a wonderful story. Thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we conclude?
Well, a lot of times with international, a lot of the fun is the differences. And I think, especially in your work where the precision of language is so critically important, in the written word and in speech. And when it's not precise, when it's not great, we can get the wrong perception. And there's also the cultural aspect of that. When people are not quite there culturally, they're a little bit off. Sometimes it's hard to put your finger on what exactly is going wrong here. It's very important to acclimate, whether it's the precision of the language or some level of being connected to that culture that you're working in. And I think that's really important to note. Some of us, fortunately, I think, have a natural ability in that to be able to do it, and also find ways when we make mistakes to correct ourselves, and to be maybe to have the integrity to recognize and to be present when you make mistakes to fix them. And every culture respects that. That's a good thing to be cognizant that there's no best culture, there's no best way to do business, but there are good ways to do business. And certainly one way everywhere in the world is to recognize your mistakes and own up to them. So I think that's certainly one thing really important for business people to be aware of. And then the other part that often is really we don't talk about too much is that we're alike. In fact, I would say people are more alike than we're different. The fundamentals of the Maslow's hierarchy, right? We want our children to be better than us, and we want a roof over our head, and we want to make an impact in the world, and all of these things. These are all very common. Somebody was telling me the other day of, mothers tend to be the ones that keep us all the same. The mother in Taiwan and in Japan and in Amsterdam and in the US, mothers treat us, wherever, very much the same, or there are some similarities to keep us on the straight and narrow. And mothers, fortunately, align a lot of our behaviors, so that I think as a business person, you understand the differences, but recognize the alignments as well. And that's a powerful thing to use in business when you can connect. If you're in a negotiation with a softball player in Taichung, Taiwan, to be able to connect to the ability to talk through a lunch and drink through that lunch and recognize that he's got a family, and he's got a child, and how many children do they, and what is important for you. Connecting at a different level like that, on a personal level, in addition to the business level, is something that's so critically important for success around the world. So remember the differences, but also remember that there's a whole host of similarities. And if you can tap into those, you'll recognize a lot of success. Global is good. It's great to be able to talk to people and listen and negotiate and mediate. And that's why, Philip, we believe that doing trade is important to prosper, but it's even more important to be able to do conversation. And that's something that the world needs more of. Stop throwing bombs at each other. There's really no reason to do that. There is a good reason, though, to do trade. There's a good reason to have conversations and to appreciate each other and our cultures, the differences and the similarities.
Very well said. Beautifully said. I guess in your next lifetime, you can be appointed to be Secretary General of the United Nations.
Those people are fantastic, right? The diplomats, and when you see a good diplomat, it really is extraordinary. And a lot of my own success, I think, in Japan was watching the fellow who I took over for as the head of the joint venture, and watching the diplomacy and the patience and the calmness amidst lots of chaos, for a leader to be able to be calm and to be patient, like the woman case that I mentioned earlier, right, where they wouldn't let her. You can get angry, but that's not going to get you anywhere. Not in the short term, or definitely not in the long term. You've got to think of the long term, and to think in the long term in really almost any culture, the respect of each other and the respect of history, but also to balance that with the requirement that we need to make progress. Without progress, the Japanese would never have, overtaken the U.S. automotive industry, right? It took an American, Dr. W. Edwards Deming, to go over and explain to the Japanese, hey, I've got all these ideas. The Americans don't want to listen to it. What do you think of this? They embraced it. And so they can embrace change, and people everywhere can embrace change, as long as it's created in a context that allows them to be successful. And that's really, I think, the challenge for all of us as leaders, is understanding, but also recognizing that we can do better in everywhere in the world. And so how can we find a way to get to that path that wants people to make the journey, for them to be successful, to allow women to sell to Toyota, to allow innovation to happen in companies? It's very doable and very possible. It's the challenge that keeps me coming to work every single day, and I don't want to stop. I'm going to hopefully being able to do it for many more years.
That's outstanding. Thank you. So this has been a wonderful conversation with Doug Bruhnke, the CEO of the Global Chamber. And Doug, thank you so much for joining us.
I really appreciate the opportunity. I really appreciate the work that you do. Thank you for keeping these kinds of stories, this information front and center. We definitely want to get more people involved with international business. It is not only enjoyable, but it also changes lives, your own life, if you get involved, and also the lives of many other people. So I hope, if you happen to maybe be inspired by the possibility of doing more international work, I encourage you to do that, because it's very satisfying, very rewarding, and you'll have thousands of stories that, so hopefully I didn't bore anyone with some of these stories. I've tried to pare it back, but you'll have a lifetime of stories that will make your life even more and more interesting. Especially if you drink whiskey. Very good. Thank you, Doug. Wonderful pleasure speaking with you. A pleasure. Thank you, Philip.